Have you ever met someone who never cries? No matter what happens, heartbreak, loss, grief, stress, their eyes stay dry. People admire them for being strong, for holding it together, for never breaking down. But psychology says people who never cry aren't stronger than everyone else. They're often more hurt, more guarded, and more disconnected from their emotions than anyone realizes. Let's break down the real psychology behind people who never cry. 1. They learned crying was dangerous or shameful. For many people who don't cry, the inability started in childhood. Maybe they cried as a kid and were told to stop being weak. Maybe a parent yelled at them for showing emotion. Maybe they were mocked, punished, or abandoned when they were vulnerable. Psychologists call this emotional invalidation or emotion suppression conditioning. They learned that crying leads to rejection, shame, or danger. So their brain created a defense mechanism. Shut down the tears before they come. Research shows that children who are consistently told not to cry develop alexithymia, difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. As adults, they don't choose not to cry. They literally can't access that emotional release anymore. The pathway has been blocked by years of conditioning that crying equals weakness. 2. They have emotional numbness from trauma. Trauma doesn't always make people cry more. Sometimes it makes them cry less, or not at all. Psychologists explain that severe or prolonged trauma can cause emotional numbing, a protective mechanism where the brain shuts down emotional responses to avoid being overwhelmed. People who have experienced abuse, neglect, violence, or significant loss sometimes lose the ability to cry because feeling anything fully would break them. Research shows that trauma survivors often dissociate from their emotions as a survival strategy. They're not cold or unfeeling. They're protecting themselves from pain that feels too big to process. Crying requires vulnerability and connection to your feelings. And when your feelings have been the source of unbearable pain, your brain learns to disconnect from them entirely. 3. They equate crying with losing control. Some people never cry because they're terrified of what might happen if they start. They believe that if they let one tear fall, they won't be able to stop, that the floodgates will open and they'll completely fall apart. Psychologists call this fear of emotional overwhelm or catastrophic thinking about vulnerability. They've spent their entire life maintaining control, keeping it together, staying strong, and crying feels like the ultimate loss of that control. Research shows that people with anxiety and perfectionist tendencies often suppress crying because they fear the intensity of their own emotions. They're not emotionless. They're holding back an ocean of pain they're afraid will drown them if they let it out. So they stay composed, stay strong, stay numb, because the alternative feels too dangerous. 4. They were forced to be the strong one. Many people who don't cry grew up being the caretaker, the one everyone leaned on, the responsible sibling, the parent to their own parents, the rock that held the family together. Psychologists say this creates a rigid identity where showing weakness feels like betrayal. They learned early that they couldn't afford to fall apart because everyone else was already broken. Research shows that children who are parentified, forced into adult roles too young, often suppress their own emotional needs entirely. They don't cry because crying means they're not strong enough to carry everyone else. And if they're not strong, who will be? They sacrifice their emotional health to maintain a role they never chose but feel trapped in. And years later, even when no one's depending on them anymore, they still can't let themselves cry. The pattern is too deeply ingrained. 5. They've disconnected from their emotions entirely. Some people don't cry because they don't feel sadness the way others do. Not because they're heartless, but because they've spent so long suppressing emotions that they've lost touch with them completely. Psychologists call this dissociation or chronic emotional detachment. They go through painful experiences and feel nothing. Breakups, deaths, failures. Their brain doesn't register it emotionally. It's like watching their life happen to someone else. Research shows that prolonged emotional suppression actually changes brain function, particularly in areas related to emotional processing. They're not choosing to be numb. They've been numb for so long that they don't remember what feeling deeply even feels like. Crying would require connecting to emotions they've buried so deeply they can't find them anymore. 6. They believe their pain doesn't deserve tears. This is heartbreaking. Some people don't cry because they've convinced themselves their suffering isn't valid enough. They compare their pain to others and decide theirs doesn't measure up. Other people have it worse. This isn't worth crying over. I should be grateful. Psychologists call this pain minimization or comparative suffering. They've internalized the message that their emotions don't matter unless they're extreme. Research shows that people who grew up in environments where their feelings were dismissed often develop this pattern. They only allow themselves to feel when the pain is objectively catastrophic. And even then, they might not cry because they've trained themselves to believe they don't deserve that release. So they carry everything silently, convinced that their hurt isn't legitimate enough to express. 7. Crying feels too vulnerable and exposing. For some people, tears are the ultimate form of vulnerability, and vulnerability feels terrifying. Psychologists link this to fear of intimacy, trust issues, and past experiences where vulnerability was weaponized against them. Maybe they cried in front of someone who used it to manipulate them. Maybe their tears were met with mockery or indifference. Maybe showing emotion made them a target. Research shows that people with avoidant attachment styles often suppress crying because it requires showing others their pain. And showing pain means risking rejection, judgment, or being hurt when they're at their most defenseless. So they keep their tears locked away. Not because they're strong, but because being vulnerable has never felt safe. Crying means letting someone see them break, and they can't afford to let anyone that close. 8. They've cried so much they ran out of tears. Sometimes people who never cry used to cry constantly. They cried through trauma, through heartbreak, through years of pain. But eventually, something broke. They hit a point where the tears just stopped. Psychologists say this can happen after prolonged grief or chronic stress. The emotional system becomes so overloaded that it shuts down completely. Research shows that emotional exhaustion can lead to a state called emotional flatness, where people lose the capacity to feel intensely. They're not healed, they're depleted. They've cried so much that their body can't produce that response anymore. It's like a well that's run dry. They want to cry. They need to, but nothing comes. And that absence of tears doesn't mean they're okay. It means they're beyond the point where tears can express how broken they feel. So if you're someone who never cries, or you know someone like this, understand this. Not crying doesn't make you strong. It makes you human with a specific way of protecting yourself. But holding everything in comes at a cost. Suppressed emotions don't disappear. They live in your body as tension, anxiety, illness, and disconnection. You don't have to force yourself to cry, but you do need to find healthy ways to release what you're carrying. Therapy, journaling, movement, art. Something that lets the pressure out before it destroys you from the inside. And to everyone else, stop praising people for not crying. Stop calling it strength. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is finally let themselves break. If you want to understand the psychology behind emotional suppression and healing, subscribe now. Because on this channel, we don't glorify toxic strength. We honor the courage it takes to feel.